The shadow arrived before the sound did. It fell across the barley in a single sweep, wide as a house, and every man in that field looked up at once. On the ridge above them stood something that should not have been able to stand. 5 times the height of a grown man, skin the color of old bone, cracked at the joints like weathered stone. A head without hair, eyes set deep in a heavy skull, and a stillness in it that was worse than movement. It watched them the way a man watches insects in grain. Then it stepped down off the ridge, and the ground moved under their feet. That was the world before the flood. Not a wilderness. Not a scattering of tents. A world with cities in it, with walls and gates and granaries, with music and metalwork and law. Men had learned to build in stone and to cast in bronze. They had learned to store a harvest against a bad year, to raise a wall against a raid, to write down what was owed. In the space of a few generations they had made something that had never existed before. And in the space of a few more, it was gone, and the only thing left of it was a story about water. The Bible tells the beginning of that collapse in 4 verses, and then it moves on. It says that when men began to multiply on the earth, the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And it says this, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. That is all Genesis gives us. A name, a parentage, and a reputation. It does not tell us how tall they were. It does not describe their faces, their color, their voices, or their bones. Everything you are about to see of their appearance is reconstruction, the way a film reconstructs a battle from a single line in a chronicle. What Genesis does give us is the shape of the disaster. Something crossed a boundary it was never meant to cross, and children were born who should never have existed. There is an older book that tells the rest, and we should be honest about what it is. The book of Enoch is not part of the Hebrew Bible. It was written long after Moses, it circulated widely in the centuries before Christ, and the New Testament quotes it once. It is a witness to what ancient readers believed, not a 67th book of Scripture. And what it describes is this: 200 of the watchers of heaven came down onto a mountain, bound themselves together with an oath so that none of them could turn back alone, and took wives from among the daughters of men. And their children were the giants. Enoch says they grew to a height no man could measure. He says that at first the world could feed them. The fields gave enough. The herds gave enough. Men gave what was asked and told themselves it was tribute, and that tribute was a kind of peace. There are always men who will call the first payment a kind of peace. But a thing that large does not stop growing, and it does not stop eating. A single one of them could empty a granary meant to carry a village through winter. 10 of them could strip a valley in a season. The herds went first, then the stores, then the seed grain that was never supposed to be touched, because seed grain is next year, and the people who eat their seed grain have already decided there will be no next year. And the terrible thing is how ordinary the collapse looked from inside it. There was no single night when the world ended. There was a bad harvest, and then a worse one. There was a village that stopped sending its share, and then a village that was no longer there. There were roads that people stopped using after dark, and then roads that people stopped using at all. The map of the world shrank one road at a time, and no one could say exactly when it had happened. The city held longest, because the city had walls. Men had built those walls against other men, and against other men they worked. 10 cubits of stone, a gate of bronze-bound cedar, watchmen on the towers day and night. For a while, standing behind them, it was possible to believe that the old world still existed inside them. Grain came in. Courts still met. Children were still born and named and taught the names of their grandfathers. And then one came to the wall, and the wall stopped meaning anything at all. It did not besiege the city. Sieges are what equals do to each other. It simply came, and it reached, and what it reached for it took. The watchmen on the towers were at the level of its chest. Arrows went into it and stayed there like splinters in a beam. The gate that had held against an army in the time of their fathers came apart in a single afternoon, and after that the wall was not a wall. It was a line of stone with a hole in it, and inside that line there were people who had believed a wall could save them. So the survivors did what people do when the built world stops protecting them. They went back into the rock. There are caves in that country that had not been used for anything but shelter from rain in living memory, And now there were families in them, dozens to a chamber, sitting in the dark with their backs against stone that had been there long before any wall. They learned to keep the fires small and deep, because smoke rising from a hillside is an announcement. They learned which hours were safe to fetch water. They put the children at the back, and from the mouths of those caves they watched. That is the image the old accounts keep returning to, and it is the most human thing in this entire story. A family pressed into a crack in a hillside, a mother with her hand over a child's mouth, looking out across a valley they used to farm, watching something the height of a tower walk through their fields in the gray light. Close enough to hear. Close enough to count the cracks in its skin. Nothing to do but be still, and be small, and wait for it to pass. What follows in that kind of collapse is not war. It is something quieter and much worse. The strong stopped pretending. Men who had been merchants became men who took, because taking was the only thing that still worked, and the law had nothing left to threaten them with. A man's word became worth exactly as much as the men standing behind him. Justice, which had been the thing that made a city different from a hillside, became a memory that old men argued about. Enoch says the giants turned against men, and then against the beasts, and finally against one another. He says the earth itself brought a complaint, and that the complaint was heard. That is the detail worth stopping for. The cry that reached heaven in that account is not the cry of a king or a prophet or an army. It is the cry of the ground. The blood of the innocent had gone into the soil for so long, in so many places, that the land itself became a witness against the men who lived on it. That is an old idea in the Bible, and it starts early. The first murder in Scripture ends with God telling the murderer that his brother's blood is crying out from the ground. What the ancients believed is that the ground remembers, and that it keeps a record, and that the record is eventually read aloud. And heaven answered, not with an army, not with fire on the mountains. Genesis records the verdict in one of the heaviest sentences ever written. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Read that again, because it is not what people expect. The verdict on that world does not begin in anger. It begins in grief. The word Genesis chooses is the word for pain in the heart, the same kind of pain a father carries. Whatever else the flood was, it was not a tantrum. It was a decision made by someone who was hurt by making it. And notice where the sentence falls. It does not fall on the giants alone. It falls on man, on the men who made the oath easy to keep by paying it, on the men who called the first tribute peace, on the strong who stopped pretending and the crowds who watched them and decided it was safer to agree. The world was not destroyed because monsters were in it. It was destroyed because there was almost no one left in it who would say that what was happening was wrong. Almost no one. Because in the middle of that verdict, Genesis puts one sentence that changes the entire shape of the story. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. One man, one household, one long, ridiculous, decades-long act of obedience carried out in front of neighbors who thought he had lost his mind. The same chapter that records the end of a civilization records the beginning of its rescue, and the rescue is smaller than a single one of the creatures that ended it. By then the city had become a thing that giants walked through. Not stormed. Walked through, the way a man walks through a ruined orchard, stepping over what used to be rows. Roofs open to the sky. A gate lying flat in the road with grass already coming up through it. Storerooms standing open and empty. Somewhere in that rubble were the tablets a scribe had once kept with enormous care, recording who owed what to whom, in a city where owing and paying had meant something. Nobody was reading them. And in the streets between the broken houses, the ones who had ended it moved slowly, looking for anything that was still worth taking, in a place where there was nothing left to take. When the waters came, they did not come as a storm. They came as an unmaking. The fountains of the great deep broke open from below, and the windows of heaven opened from above, and the world that men had built in stone came apart in the order it had been built. The fields went first, then the roads, then the outer walls, then the towers with the watchmen still on them. And the giants, who had never in their lives met anything they could not reach, met water, which cannot be reached, and cannot be intimidated, and does not stop. The cities of that world are not on any map. There is no ruin you can visit, no gate you can photograph, no bone in any museum that settles the question. That entire civilization exists now as 4 verses, 1 flood, and a very old book that describes what the 4 verses do not. Whether you take that literally, or as the way an ancient people told the truth about a world that destroyed itself, the shape of the story does not change. And there is one more line, and it is the one that keeps this story from staying safely in the past. Centuries after the flood, when Moses sent 12 men to look at the land of Canaan, 10 of them came back terrified, and this is what they said: "We saw the Nephilim there, and we were like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and so we were in theirs." Genesis had already said it in advance. They were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Also afterward. 2 words that have kept readers awake for 3,000 years. Some read the spy's report as terror talking, an exaggeration from frightened men, and the text does call it a bad report. Some read it as a second incursion. Some read it as a family line that survived. The Bible does not settle it. It simply leaves the phrase sitting there, in the middle of the sentence that names them, like a door someone forgot to close. That is where the first world ends. Not with a battle, and not with monsters winning, but with a civilization that made itself unlivable and a grief in heaven that decided to start over. The walls came down. The giants drowned. And one wooden vessel, built by a man everyone had laughed at, floated over the place where the first city used to be.